They called Colonel Mara Voss a boring army paper pusher for 15 years. My name is Mara Voss. I'm 43, a colonel in the United States Army, and at my sister's wedding last spring, she stood 3 feet away from me in a red satin dress and told her new husband's entire family that I worked some quiet desk job, nothing exciting, really. Her husband, a man I'd met only twice before that day, leaned toward his groomsman moments later and whispered something that visibly changed the color in my sister's face. "Colonel Voss runs black sites," he said, just loud enough for the small cluster around us to hear. "I've read the briefings. Don't let the quiet fool you." Before I explain how my brother-in-law knew details about my career that even my own sister had spent 15 years dismissing, let me take you back to where this particular family pattern actually started, because a single wedding reception doesn't create 15 years of casual condescension. It simply reveals it, all at once, in front of people who'd never questioned the story my sister had been telling. If you're the kind of person who watches a story through to the end, go ahead and subscribe, only if you genuinely mean it. Drop your city and local time in the comments, I read every one. I grew up in Frederick, Maryland, the younger of 2 daughters. My father, Walter, worked as a high school history teacher. My mother, Judith, taught elementary music. My older sister, Cecily, 4 years my senior, had always been the more outwardly ambitious one within our family's specific value system, pursuing a marketing degree, then a series of increasingly visible roles at prominent firms in D.C., building a social circle and a lifestyle that photographed well and generated easy conversation at family gatherings. I joined the Army at 18, immediately after high school, a decision that had genuinely confused my parents at the time, coming from a family with no prior military tradition. What started as a practical decision, funding for college, a structured path toward independence, gradually became a genuine career, one I pursued with an intensity that surprised even me in those early years. By my late 20s, I'd been selected for increasingly specialized assignments within military intelligence, work that came with security clearances requiring me to discuss almost nothing specific about my actual daily responsibilities with anyone outside a very narrow professional circle. At family gatherings, when relatives asked what exactly I did, I developed a practiced, deliberately vague response: logistics and coordination work, mostly administrative, a description technically true in the broadest possible sense, while omitting almost everything that actually mattered about my actual responsibilities. Cecily, over those same years, developed her own narrative about my career, one built entirely from that vague description I'd offered, without ever asking meaningful follow-up questions. "Mara does some kind of paperwork thing for the Army," she'd tell her friends, her tone carrying the specific, dismissive lightness of someone discussing a sibling's unremarkable job. "Very quiet, very boring, honestly. I have no idea how she stands it." I didn't correct that characterization for years, partly because my actual work genuinely couldn't be discussed in detail, and partly because I'd grown accustomed to a specific dynamic within our family where Cecily's visible achievements consistently received more attention and celebration than whatever quiet, classified work I was doing thousands of miles away, in locations I couldn't specify, on projects I couldn't describe. By my mid-30s, I'd risen to the rank of lieutenant colonel, working on assignments connected to detention operations oversight and intelligence coordination that placed me, at various points, in direct operational authority over facilities and programs of considerable strategic significance, work that remained, by necessity, almost entirely invisible to my own family, who continued to understand my career through the same vague, outdated lens I'd established years earlier. Cecily married her first husband at 29, a marriage that ended in divorce 4 years later, and throughout that period and the years following, she continued building the specific family narrative that positioned her own visible, easily discussed corporate career as inherently more impressive than my boring paperwork job, a characterization I'd stopped actively fighting, exhausted by the impossibility of correcting a story I couldn't actually replace with accurate details. Cecily's second engagement, to a man named Julian Ashworth, came together relatively quickly, about 18 months before the wedding where everything finally shifted. Julian worked, according to Cecily's descriptions during family calls, in government consulting, a description as deliberately vague as my own had always been, though for entirely different reasons I wouldn't fully understand until the wedding itself. I'd met Julian only twice before the wedding, once at their engagement dinner, briefly, and once at a smaller family gathering the following month. Both encounters had been pleasant but unremarkable, Julian polite and reserved in a way that read, at the time, as simple social caution around a new extended family rather than anything more deliberate. The wedding itself took place at a vineyard outside Charlottesville, Virginia, a beautiful late spring afternoon that Cecily had been planning meticulously for over a year. I'd attended in a formal dress rather than my uniform, a choice I'd made deliberately, wanting the day to remain focused entirely on my sister rather than introducing any complication about my own career into an event that was, appropriately, about her. I stood near the edge of the reception during the cocktail hour, making polite conversation with several of Julian's groomsmen, when Cecily approached with her characteristic ease, introducing me to a small cluster of Julian's extended family with the exact phrasing I'd heard variations of for 15 years. "This is my sister, Mara," she said, her voice carrying the same casual dismissiveness she'd perfected over the years. "She works some quiet desk job, nothing exciting, really. I've genuinely never fully understood what she actually does all day." I smiled, the same practiced, patient smile I'd offered dozens of times before at similar moments, prepared to let the characterization stand without correction, the way I always had. What I didn't expect was for Julian, standing just close enough to overhear that exact introduction, to turn toward his own groomsmen with an expression I couldn't immediately read, and say something that would unravel 15 years of careful, deliberate vagueness in the space of a single sentence. I drove home that night in a silence that felt considerably heavier than the 90-minute journey usually warranted, replaying my mother's casual suggestion that I could, always just rent somewhere larger, while Preston sat 3 feet away holding an envelope containing more money than I'd saved across 9 years of disciplined, independent financial planning. I didn't confront my parents that evening. I've never been someone who processes anger quickly, and I understood, even in the moment, that whatever I said in the immediate aftermath of watching that envelope change hands would come out distorted by an emotional intensity I hadn't yet fully examined. Instead, I spent the following several weeks doing something I'd never previously allowed myself to do directly. I began cataloging, deliberately and honestly, the full financial history of how my parents had supported each of their children throughout our adult lives. I called my Aunt Priscilla, my father's sister, who'd always maintained a slightly more objective vantage point on our family's internal dynamics, given her own complicated relationship with my father over decades of sibling history. "Jordan, I've watched this pattern for years," she told me, once I'd laid out the specific details of that dinner. "Your father has always found it easier to rescue Preston from consequences than to simply let him build resilience the way you were forced to build yours. I think, somewhere along the way, your independence became something your parents took for granted, rather than something they recognized as requiring its own kind of ongoing investment and acknowledgement." Over the following month, I compiled, as precisely as I could reconstruct from memory and occasional documentation, a rough accounting of the disparity. Preston's private university tuition, largely covered directly by my parents, compared to my own loans for a considerably less expensive program. Preston's rent assistance during 2 separate unemployment stretches in his mid-20s. The co-signed car loan. Now, the $60,000 house down payment, delivered with ceremony and tears, compared to my mother's breezy suggestion that I simply continue renting if my current space ever felt insufficient. The total, once I'd added everything together as honestly as I could, exceeded $140,000 in direct financial support extended to Preston over the preceding decade, against essentially nothing extended to me beyond the polite, verbal acknowledgement of my own independent achievements. I met with a financial advisor, a careful, deliberate woman named Odessa Kilbride, specifically to understand my own actual financial position with complete clarity, wanting to make any subsequent decisions from a place of genuine strategic understanding rather than simply raw emotional reaction to what I'd witnessed at that dinner. "Jordan," she said, once we'd reviewed my full financial picture, "you're actually in a considerably stronger position than I think you've been giving yourself credit for. Your condo has appreciated significantly since your purchase, your retirement savings are well ahead of typical benchmarks for your age and income level, and you're consistent, Disciplined saving habits over the preceding 9 years have put you within genuine reach of purchasing a larger home on your own, without requiring any family assistance whatsoever. That consultation crystallized something for me that I hadn't fully allowed myself to consider directly before, that I didn't actually need my parents' financial support to achieve the same milestone they'd just handed Preston with ceremony and tears. What I needed, I realized, was to actually pursue that milestone deliberately, on my own terms, in a way that would make unmistakably clear exactly how capable I'd been all along, without requiring anyone's rescue. I found a property 3 weeks after that consultation, a modest but genuinely lovely 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood about 15 minutes from my current condo, priced within a range my own savings and a standard mortgage could comfortably absorb. I moved through the entire purchase process deliberately, quietly, informing my parents only once the closing had already occurred, the same pattern of independent decision-making I'd maintained throughout most of my adult financial life. I called my mother the evening after closing, keeping my tone deliberately neutral, informational rather than confrontational. "Mom, I wanted to let you know, I closed on a house today. 3 bedrooms, really lovely neighborhood, about 15 minutes from my old place." There was a pause on the line, longer than I expected. "Jordan, that's wonderful. I had no idea you were even looking. How did you manage the down payment?" "Through my own savings, Mom. The same way I've managed everything else over the past 9 years." Another pause, this one carrying a different quality, something closer to discomfort. "I wish you'd told us you were considering this. Your father and I might have wanted to help, the same way we helped Preston." I felt something steady settle in my chest, hearing that specific offer, arriving only now that I'd already demonstrated I didn't actually need it. "Mom, I think if I'm honest, I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure the offer would have actually materialized the same way it did for Preston. I watched you and Dad hand him $60,000 with tears and ceremony, 3 weeks after telling me I could just rent somewhere if my condo ever felt too small. I didn't want to find out, by asking directly, whether that same generosity would have actually extended to me." The silence that followed that comment stretched considerably longer than any previous pause in our conversation, and I understood, waiting through it, that I'd finally said something my mother couldn't easily deflect or reframe into a more comfortable narrative. The rest of the party unfolded in a kind of surreal aftermath, guests approaching me throughout the remaining hours with a curiosity that felt entirely different from anything I'd experienced at a family gathering in years. My mother's book club friend, the one who'd been standing beside her when I handed over the business card, spent nearly 15 minutes asking detailed questions about Meridian's work, genuinely interested in a way that made clear she'd absorbed my mother's correction completely. Desmond found me near the dessert table about an hour later, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of guilt and genuine surprise. "Faith, I had no idea," he said. "I mean, I knew you left school, obviously, but I never really understood why, and I definitely didn't know about the consulting firm. Mom always talked about it like you just gave up, I guess, and I never thought to question that." "Why would you have questioned it?" I said, not unkindly. "You were 15 when I left. You grew up with the story Mom told, the same way everyone else at this party did. I don't blame you for believing it. I blame myself, a little, for not fighting harder to correct it sooner. What made tonight different? Why say something now, after all these years of not correcting it?" I thought about that question for a moment, turning it over honestly before answering. I think I finally got tired of protecting Mom from a truth that was never actually shameful in the first place. I left college to help this family survive a crisis. That's not a failure story, Desmond. That's a sacrifice story. I just let Mom's version of events stand for years because I didn't want to make her feel guilty, and somewhere along the way, protecting her feelings became more important than correcting the record about my own life. Miles approached separately, later that evening, considerably quieter than Desmond had been, his expression carrying something closer to genuine distress. "Faith, I've been thinking about this since Mom's toast. I got to finish medical school. I got to become exactly what this family always wanted one of us to become. And I think part of why I got that chance was specifically because you left school to help cover the gap in my treatment costs. I never really let myself think about that connection directly until tonight. Miles, I don't want you carrying guilt about this. I made that decision because I wanted to, because keeping this family stable mattered more to me at 19 than finishing a degree on the original timeline. You didn't take anything from me. If anything, watching you finish medical school this year has been one of the things I'm proudest of in this entire family. I still feel like I should have asked more questions over the years, he said. About what you were actually doing, about why the waitress story never quite made sense once I got old enough to actually think critically about it. My father found me alone near the parking lot as the party wound down, his expression carrying an exhaustion that seemed to extend beyond just the evening's unexpected drama. Faith, I should have corrected your mother's story years ago. I knew the truth about why you left school. I let her simplify it into something easier to explain at parties, because it felt easier than reopening the whole conversation about that period. That was a failure on my part, not just hers. I appreciate you saying that, Dad. I think, honestly, everyone in this family found it easier to just accept Mom's version rather than push back on it, myself included for a long time. I'm not trying to distribute blame at this point. I just needed, finally, for the actual story to exist in the room instead of the simplified one. My mother approached me last, as most of the remaining guests were saying their goodbyes. The earlier shock of the broken glass and public correction now settled into something quieter and more reflective. Faith, can we talk properly? Not at a party, with people listening. Just the two of us, sometime this week before you fly back to Chicago. I agreed, and we met 2 days later at a quiet coffee shop near my parents' house, away from the noise and performance of a family gathering, just the two of us working through 15 years of accumulated misunderstanding in a conversation that took nearly 3 hours to fully unfold. I need you to understand something, my mother said, early in that conversation. I think, back when you left college, I was so overwhelmed by everything happening at once, your father's job, Miles's diagnosis, the mortgage, that I couldn't fully process what you were actually sacrificing to help us. It was easier, somehow, to tell myself and everyone else that you'd simply struggled with the workload, because that story didn't require me to sit with the guilt of having a 19-year-old daughter give up her education to keep this family financially stable. I understand that instinct, I said. But Mom, that story didn't just protect you from guilt. It cost me 15 years of being introduced as a disappointment at every family gathering, while Desmond and Miles got introduced with genuine pride for paths that, frankly, existed partly because of what I gave up. I know, she said quietly. I've had 2 days to really sit with that, and I don't have a good excuse anymore. I think somewhere along the way, believing the simpler story became easier than confronting what it actually cost you, and I let that comfort matter more than actually knowing my own daughter's real life. We sat with that admission for a long moment, the coffee between us gone lukewarm, before my mother asked something I hadn't fully anticipated. Faith, I want to actually understand what you've built. Not the business card version. The real version. Would you be willing to walk me through it properly? Over the following weeks, I did something I'd never done with my mother before. I invited her into the actual substance of my career, rather than continuing to let her absorb only the surface-level corrections that had emerged at the party. I sent her the business journal profile. I walked her, over a long phone call, through Meridian's origin story, how I'd met my co-founders, Priya and Jonas, both former colleagues from my restaurant management days, how we'd identified a gap in the market for hospitality operations consulting specifically tailored to independent restaurants struggling to compete against larger chains. I explained the actual mechanics of our work, the financial audits we conducted for struggling clients, the operational restructuring plans we designed, the specific case studies where our intervention had saved businesses from closure, including one particularly meaningful project where we'd helped a family-owned diner remarkably similar to Sylvie's original establishment avoid bankruptcy through a comprehensive restructuring of their supply chain and staffing model. My mother listened to all of it with a genuine attentiveness that felt entirely new, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she was actually absorbing the details rather than simply nodding politely until she could redirect to something more comfortable. I had no idea any of this required this level of financial expertise, she admitted, during one of these calls. I think I'd genuinely convinced myself, over the years, that hospitality meant something closer to what you were doing at 19, rather than understanding it as an entire field of business strategy. 3 months after that birthday party, my mother visited me in Chicago for the first time in over 6 years, a trip she'd never previously prioritized despite my repeated invitations over the preceding decade. I gave her an actual tour of Meridian's offices, introduced her to Priya and Jonas, let her sit in on a portion of a client strategy meeting where she watched, firsthand, the kind of detailed financial and operational analysis that constituted my actual daily work. I owe you an apology that goes beyond what I said at the party, she told me, during dinner that evening, in a restaurant I'd chosen specifically because Meridian had consulted on its recent operational turnaround. I spent 15 years telling a story about you that was not only inaccurate, but actively cruel, without ever bothering to update it based on actual evidence available to me the entire time. I think the real failure wasn't just that first mistaken story back when you were 19. It was that I never once, in 15 years, asked you a genuine, curious question about what your actual life looked like, because I'd already decided I knew the answer. I appreciate you saying that clearly, I told her. I think what hurt most, over the years, wasn't really the initial misunderstanding about why I left school. It was watching you ask genuine, detailed questions about Desmond's job, about Miles's medical school applications, while treating my entire adult life as a settled, an interesting story that didn't warrant further investigation. I understand that now, she said. I don't think I can fully undo 15 years of that pattern in a single dinner. But I want you to know I intend to keep asking real questions from here forward, not because I feel guilty, though I do, but because I genuinely want to understand the actual person you've become, rather than the outdated story I let define you for so long. Desmond and Miles, in the months following that birthday party, both made similar efforts to rebuild a more accurate understanding of my life, Desmond asking detailed questions about Meridian's client acquisition strategy during a visit to Chicago that spring. Miles, once his medical school schedule allowed, spending an entire weekend genuinely curious about the operational side of restaurant consulting in a way that felt like real sibling interest rather than obligatory family catch-up. The following year, at what would have been my mother's 61st birthday, the family gathering felt entirely different from the one that had preceded it. My mother's toast that year included, unprompted, an accurate and detailed description of Meridian's recent expansion into a fifth state, alongside genuine updates about Desmond's promotion and Miles's residency placement, all three of her children's accomplishments discussed with equal curiosity and pride for what felt like the first time in 15 years. I sat, that year, not near the kitchen door, but at the head table alongside my brothers, listening to my mother describe all three of our lives with an accuracy and warmth that I'd genuinely stopped believing I'd ever hear directed at my own path. Two years have passed since that 60th birthday party where a wine glass shattered on tile and, along with it, 15 years of an inaccurate story about who I actually was. Meridian Hospitality Consulting has since expanded into a sixth state, and last year, we were approached by a much larger hospitality investment firm interested in a potential partnership that would allow us to scale our operational consulting model into a broader turnaround fund for struggling independent restaurants nationally. My mother knows all of this now in genuine, current detail, not because I've made a point of proving anything to her, but because she asks, regularly, with a curiosity that has become entirely normal between us rather than the notable exception it once was. I got married last fall, to a man named Elias I'd been with for 4 years, a fellow entrepreneur who'd witnessed, over the course of our relationship, the entire arc of my family's slow recalibration and had commented, more than once, on how meaningful it was to watch a 15-year-old wound finally begin to heal in real time. My mother gave a toast at that wedding that I still think about often, standing in front of family and friends who'd known me at every stage of the story, the 19-year-old who left college, the diner waitress, the operations manager, and finally, the consulting firm partner standing in a wedding dress that evening. I told a story about my daughter for 15 years that wasn't true, she said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of the admission. I called her the one who didn't finish college, as though that single fact defined everything about who she was. What I've learned since is that Faith didn't fail at anything. She made an extraordinary sacrifice at 19 to help this family survive one of the hardest periods of our lives, and then she built something remarkable in the years since, entirely on her own terms, without ever once asking this family to properly acknowledge what that sacrifice actually cost her. I'm not proud of how long it took me to see that clearly. I am, without reservation, enormously proud of the daughter I finally took the time to actually know. I cried during that toast, not from the old, familiar humiliation I'd absorbed at gatherings for 15 years, but from the specific relief of finally hearing my own mother articulate, publicly, completely, exactly what I'd built and exactly what it had cost me, a relief I hadn't fully realized I was still waiting for until it finally arrived. Miles, now in his final year of residency, mentioned during a recent visit that he'd started telling his own colleagues about Meridian's work, using it, unprompted, as an example when discussing healthcare administration and operational efficiency parallels between hospitals and restaurants. I used to just say my sister was in the restaurant business, he told me. Now I actually explain what that means, because I finally understand it well enough to explain it properly myself. I think, often, about the version of that birthday party where I might have simply absorbed my mother's introduction the way I'd absorbed dozens of similar moments before it, smiling, staying quiet, letting the comfortable, familiar story stand uncorrected for another year, another decade, protecting her from a guilt she'd spent 15 years avoiding at the cost of my own accurate history. What actually happened instead, the business card, the shattered glass, the uncomfortable public correction, and the years of genuine rebuilding that followed it, required a kind of quiet courage I hadn't fully recognized in myself until I was standing in front of 60 guests, watching my mother's hand tremble around a wine glass that could no longer hold the weight of a story that had simply, finally, stopped being true. I was zipping my briefcase closed when I heard slow footsteps behind me. I turned, and Walter Halbrook stood a few feet away, his hands loose at his sides, looking, for the first time in the 12 years I'd known him, genuinely uncertain of himself. "I owe you an apology," he said. I didn't say anything. I just waited, the way I'd learned to wait through 100 briefings where the important part always came after the pause. "I spent 12 years believing my son built that company entirely on his own," Walter said, his voice cracking slightly in a way I'd never heard from him before. "I judged you before I ever tried to actually understand what you were doing every time you left." He looked toward the courtroom doors, then back at me. "I thought your deployments meant you weren't committed to this family. I never once considered that every time you left, you were giving something up for all of us." His eyes met mine, and whatever pride had carried him through that morning was entirely gone from them now. "I'm sorry, Renata." The apology sounded genuine. "I want to be honest about that, because I think it's important. People are rarely purely one thing, and Walter's regret in that moment wasn't performance the way so much of that morning had been. But genuine apology and earned forgiveness aren't the same transaction, and I wasn't willing to pretend they were just because he'd finally found the humility to offer one. "I appreciate that," I told him. Something in his face relaxed, just for a moment, like he thought that might be the end of it. You spent years judging the uniform, I said quietly, looking straight at it every holiday dinner without ever once seeing the woman wearing it. Walter closed his eyes. There was nothing left to say after that, and he seemed to understand it as clearly as I did. He nodded once, turned, and walked out of the courtroom. I never saw him again. Outside, the Tulsa afternoon felt warmer than I remembered it being that morning. A couple of reporters had gathered near the courthouse steps, the story of a decorated Air Force major uncovering a hidden legal clause that unraveled her ex-husband's company had apparently traveled faster through the building than I'd expected. Marcus glanced at me. Want to say anything to them? No, I said. Not even a little bit of a victory lap. I smiled and shook my head. I have somewhere else to be. 2 days later, before sunrise, I parked outside Tinker Air Force Base the way I had 1,000 mornings before that one. Soldiers jogged along the perimeter road, some carrying coffee, some carrying rucksacks, the ordinary rhythm of a life that had kept moving steadily forward the whole time my personal one had felt frozen inside a courtroom. I unlocked my office, hung my service jacket on the hook by the door, and looked at the gold oak leaves on the shoulders for a long moment before I sat down at my desk. Those oak leaves had never meant what people outside the service usually assumed they meant. They weren't a symbol of authority, not really, not to me. They were 14 years of choosing duty over comfort, of extending deployments to fund someone else's future, of learning to hold a room's respect through discipline instead of volume. I thought about Walter calling my career the thing that had cost him a daughter-in-law's presence at holiday dinners, never once understanding it was the same career that had built the very company he'd spent a decade being proud of. The following spring, 6 months after the ruling, I used part of the settlement to fund something small but permanent, a legal aid initiative through a nonprofit that serves military spouses navigating divorce, specifically the ones whose contributions to a marriage's finances never made it onto any deed or ownership document because somebody, at some point, had told them it would be simpler that way. We named it, with Arthur Kensington's blessing, the Contingent Fund, a small, deliberate joke that only a handful of people would ever fully understand, and one I liked precisely because of that. Arthur, in his late 70s now, still comes in twice a month to review case files with the small staff we've built, mostly because he says retirement bores him and he'd rather spend his remaining working years making sure fewer military spouses discover, a decade too late, that they never protected what they'd actually built. I didn't remarry in the years that followed, not out of bitterness, but because I genuinely wasn't in a hurry to. I made captain, then major, in the years that mattered most for my career, and I found that the specific quiet of an empty house, after 17 years of never quite having one that felt entirely mine, was its own kind of relief I hadn't expected to enjoy as much as I did. Grant sold his remaining stake in Halbrook Renewable Systems 18 months after the divorce was finalized. I heard, secondhand, that he took a quieter role at a smaller engineering firm 2 states away, the kind of job with regular hours and no expansion plans and nobody's name on the building. I don't know if that was penance or simply exhaustion. I've stopped trying to guess which, because it isn't really my work to finish anymore. A year after the ruling, I stood at the edge of the parade field at Tinker before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, watching the first formation of the day move through their warm-up drills, and I thought about something Judge Hale had said, almost offhandedly, as I was leaving her courtroom that afternoon. Major Voss, she'd said, catching me near the door. In 26 years, I've watched a great many people walk into my courtroom absolutely certain the loudest version of events would win. Very few of them understand that the truth doesn't need volume. It just needs someone patient enough to let it arrive on its own schedule. I've carried that sentence with me longer than I've carried almost anything else from that year. People sometimes ask me, when the story comes up, and it does, more than I expected, usually from other service members going through something similar, what it felt like watching Judge Hale laugh over that first page of the agreement, watching Walter's face go from smug to ashen in the span of about 90 seconds, watching Dana walk out through those courtroom doors without a single look back. I tell them the truth, which is that it didn't feel like triumph, not really. It felt like something much quieter finally being allowed to exhale. Money came and went in the years after that. The company Grant had built with my capital and his own genuine effort kept operating, under new leadership, employing people who had nothing to do with any of what happened in that courtroom, and I found I didn't much care to follow its fortunes one way or the other. Companies grow. Companies get sold. People disappoint you, sometimes for years before you finally have the proof you need to stop excusing it. Promises get broken, even the ones signed in ink and witnessed by the very people who should have protected them most. But character isn't built in a single courtroom moment, however dramatic. It's built in the 14 years before it, in the deployments extended for someone else's tuition, in the 3 weeks spent researching a lending program instead of giving up, in the decision to wait 14 months with a sealed envelope in a briefcase instead of using it the moment I found it, because I wanted the record to show, honestly and completely, exactly what kind of marriage I'd actually been living inside. That morning at the parade field, watching the sun spread slowly across the grass, I understood something I wished I'd understood years earlier, back in a kitchen in San Antonio with a window unit that never quite won its fight against the summer heat. The strongest thing I carried through that whole ordeal wasn't my rank. It wasn't the evidence sitting in an old envelope, and it wasn't even the ruling itself. It was patience, the specific, disciplined patience to prepare instead of panic, to stay silent when everyone in that courtroom expected me to break, to trust that truth doesn't always arrive first, but if you're patient enough and honest enough with yourself in the meantime, it almost always arrives exactly when it needs to. I still keep that old envelope, empty now, in the bottom drawer of my desk at Tinker, tucked beneath a folder of case files for the contingent fund. I don't need it for anything practical anymore. I keep it because some mornings, on the hard ones, it reminds me that the quietest person in a room isn't always the one who's lost. Sometimes she's simply the only one who already knows exactly how the story ends.